The air hung thick with heat and dust on the Ashford plantation, a slow, suffocating weight that clung to every surface. Even in the shade of the cypress trees that lined the cotton fields, there was little relief. The year was 1864, and though the war raged on just beyond the horizon, the rhythms of the South clung stubbornly to their old ways, refusing to admit the change marching steadily toward them. Lena had learned from early childhood that survival meant stillness, quiet hands, lowered eyes, and a silence that was both armor and prison. But her mind had never been still. While her body toiled in the gardens or bent over laundry behind the big house, her thoughts ran wild. Memories of her mother's lullabies, dreams of her brother Josiah, who'd been sold 2 winters past, and questions. Always questions. The kind of questions that would have surprised the professor that taught at the university, that behind those carefully lowered and dimmed brown eyes, there was intelligence that matched his own. It was during one of those humid dusks, when the work was done, but the pain of the day still lingered, that she first noticed Thomas Ashford watching her. He was the second son in the big house. But he had been sent off to France as a boy not long after she herself had been born. He had only returned a few weeks ago and was seldom seen outside the house. He stood now on the veranda with a leather-bound book in one hand, pretending to read, but his eyes drifted toward the garden too often to be coincidence. He was not like the others. Too thin, too quiet, not cruel, not like his father, the colonel, whose voice cracked like a whip even when no leather was involved. Thomas's gaze lingered with curiosity, not a little sympathy and guilt rather than ownership. But he was a white man all the same, and Lena told herself, even as she felt the deep burn of heat in her cheeks as only a young girl can feel who has never been in love, that she must not trust him. But she could not help but notice the difference in him. Even the other slaves talked about it. Her mother, too. He didn't shout. He didn't swagger. And once, when Simone had tripped with a basket of potatoes, she'd caught him move to help before stopping himself, glancing around to make sure no one saw his hand halfway outstretched. One evening, after she'd finished turning the soil beneath the azaleas, she rose to find him watching again, this time from the edge of the garden path. "You've been out here for hours," he said. His voice was soft, like he was afraid of hurting her even with his voice. Lena straightened, wiping sweat and soil from her hands. "Yes, sir?" He winced. "You don't have to call me that." She said nothing, the weight of every rule pressed against her tongue. He began, then hesitated, shifting the book in his hands. "Do you know how to read?" Lena lifted her eyes for the briefest moment. "No, sir. I could teach you," he said. She stepped back and glanced quickly around her. She knew, as did every other slave in the South, the mortal danger that learning to read would pose. He stood for a few moments watching her, and then, seeming to make up his mind, he stepped quickly toward her, closing the space between them and lowering his voice almost to a whisper. "Meet me behind the barn tonight. I'll wait for you." She looked at him again, longer this time. He wore guilt like an ill-fitting coat, but there was something else there too, something aching and sincere. Again, she felt the heat rise to her face. His proximity was unsettling, but what he was offering was dangerous. She should not trust this man. "I don't want to learn, sir," she said, "but I will wait for you anyway." He said urgently. Lena didn't answer. She didn't nod. But that evening, against her better judgment, as twilight settled like mist over the fields, she lingered near the barn instead of heading back to the quarters. She knew she would not be missed for a few hours, not with her mother having to work until late into the night, and Jacob, her younger brother, now living in the men's quarters. He came, with the book and a piece of chalk. They began with letters scratched on the side of the old wooden shed. "A," he said, drawing it carefully. "For apple." "Apple," she echoed, tasting the word like it was forbidden fruit. By the second week, they were forming words. By the third, short sentences. She learned fast, hungry for the meanings hidden in pages she'd once believed were off-limits forever. And as she learned, she taught. When the lessons ended for the night, Thomas would ask her questions about what it felt like to wake before the sun and work until it fell again, about her family, about her dreams. He asked about the song she hummed under her breath while working, told her it stuck in his head even when he didn't know the words. So she told him. It was a freedom song her mother had sung while combing her hair as a child. "I don't understand how people can live like this," he said one night, his voice tight with shame. "We don't live like this," she replied. "We survive it." The words struck him like a stone to the chest. They were careful, always looking over shoulders, always listening for footsteps. A missed moment could be fatal. But they met almost every night. One rainy night, Lena arrived with her skirt hem soaked and her hair still wet. She didn't expect to find him there that night, not with the new rumors about the war and the hard words that had been heard by all passing between father and son. But Thomas was waiting just inside the door. She paused beside him, brushing water from her brow. "You're early," she said. "I wanted to come before the rain started," he admitted. "Worried about the war?" "Yes," he said, "but more about this." He took her suddenly in his arms, pulling her close to himself in one swift movement, but then he paused and looked into her eyes. When he saw her frightened eyes soften, he kissed her gently, relieved to find an answer to his unspoken question. Then he simply held her in his arms, wishing they could stand there forever. "What would you do if you were free?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Find Josiah, my brother. He was sold to a place near Charleston. I'd find him if I could." Thomas's hands clenched around the spine of the book. "What about you?" she asked, surprising them both. He laughed bitterly. "Run. I don't belong here. Never did." They stood in silence again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything worth saying felt too dangerous. But in that silence, something solidified. An understanding, a question neither dared ask yet, but one they would not stop asking in the days to come. When she finally turned to go, he stopped her with one word. "Tomorrow?" Lena gave the slightest nod. "Tomorrow." And in that quiet promise, the first fragile thread of escape began to form, woven not just of rebellion or desperation, but of something gentler and far more dangerous: hope. The war crept closer in gunpowder wisps and the distant echo of cannon fire. Though battles were still miles away, the Ashford plantation felt the tremors. Soldiers sometimes passed through, their boots leaving churned soil and fear in their wake. But within the manor, the rhythms of old life stubbornly lingered. Cotton was picked, orders barked, punishments delivered. The Confederacy may have been fraying at the edges, but within the white-pillared house, its heart still beat with cruelty. Thomas felt it more each day. He had returned from university a year earlier, full of books, questions, and a soft kind of defiance, but the war had changed everything. His older brother Henry had gone to fight, full of fire and talk of glory. His father, the colonel, poured himself deeper into plantation life, into the rhythms of ownership, power, and control. Thomas tried at first to tread the middle, help where he could, question quietly, watch without being watched. But it grew harder by the day, especially after meeting Lena. Their secret reading lessons had given him a glimpse into a world far beyond his own, one filled with pain, yes, but also with resilience, intelligence, dignity. She carried herself with a quiet strength that haunted him, especially when he compared it to the brittle pride of his family. But nothing shook him more than the day Jacob disappeared. Lena didn't come to the shed that night, or the next. On the third evening, Thomas found her near the stables, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her back pressed against the cool wooden wall. "They sold him," she said without looking up. "Jacob?" She nodded. Her voice was hoarse. "He ran away to join the Union forces, but they caught him. A slaver came from Georgia. He's gone." Thomas knelt beside her, unsure of what to say, unsure if he had the right to say anything at all. His heart pounded with guilt, heavy and bitter. I didn't know," he said finally. "If I had." "If you had what?" she asked, sharply now, her eyes glistening. "Stopped them? Told them no? You think your father would have listened to you?" Thomas looked away. The truth stung more because he knew it already. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She was quiet a long time, then asked softly, "Do you know what it's like to be afraid every morning that someone you love will just be gone?" He didn't. Not really. Not like that. That night, something shifted in Thomas. It had been building for months, the unease, the anger, the cracks in his once comfortable world. But now, with Lena's pain so raw in front of him, the foundation finally began to collapse. At breakfast the next day, the colonel spoke proudly of a new shipment of shackles ordered from Savannah. "Extra iron in 'em," he said. "They'll hold, even on the big bucks. No more runners." Thomas put down his fork. "You talk about people like they're livestock," he said. The room went silent. His mother stiffened, teacup midair. The colonel looked up slowly. "What did you say to me, boy?" "They're not animals," Thomas continued, more boldly now. "They're human beings, and Jacob was just a kid." "He was a strong back and nothing more," the colonel snapped, his finger pointing at his son and his voice low with rage. "And if you plan to inherit anything from me, you'd better learn to think the same." Thomas stood up, chair scraping loud across the polished floor. "Then maybe I don't want any part of it." He left the room without another word. The confrontation didn't lead to immediate exile or disownment, but it made his position in the house even more tenuous. The help whispered when he passed. His mother clutched her pearls tighter, and the colonel began watching him with a kind of cold calculation. That week, Thomas started sneaking food out to the quarters at night. Bread, fruit, scraps from the kitchen he knew would otherwise be tossed. He found small ways to help, distracting overseers, unlocking doors, passing notes between separated families. But the guilt remained. He could not erase his name or his blood. He could not undo Jacob's loss. Lena began to distance herself, not with words, but in presence. She was quieter, more guarded. When he offered books, she accepted them with a nod, but no longer stayed to read. When he spoke, she listened, but said little. One night, as they met in the orchard away from prying eyes, he finally asked, "Do you hate me now?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but you don't trust me." She looked at him, and in her gaze was a sadness deeper than anger. "It's not about trust. It's about the world we live in. You walk in it free. I walk in it watched. And even when we're together, we're still in different worlds." Thomas wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because she was right. "I want to change that," he said. "Then start by seeing it," she replied. "Really seeing it." So he did. He walked the fields by day and listened, not to his father's orders, but to the voices of those who worked them. He noticed the scars on backs, the calluses on hands, the empty places where families used to be. He paid attention to how children stopped laughing when the colonel entered the yard. And each day, the world he thought he knew unraveled a little more. He began recording names, dates, the locations of shacks, the timing of patrols, the maps drawn in dirt and quickly wiped clean. He was preparing, not just for a break, but for an escape, one that would take Lena with him, one that might, God willing, help her find her brothers too. But time was short, and the walls of the manor were closing in. Late one night, as the moon climbed above the tobacco fields, Lena met him by the edge of the woods. "You asked what I wanted," she said. "I want to live, not just survive." Thomas nodded, eyes burning. "Then we run," she hesitated. "You'd leave all this?" He took her hand. "It was never mine. My father sent me to France to grow up with my mother's family just to get me out of his sight. He has hated something in me ever since I was a child." Behind them, the manor lights still burned. The house loomed, white and proud and crumbling inside. Ahead lay miles of uncertainty, the wilds of the South, soldiers, dogs, risk, and death for both of them, because the same fate awaited darkies and darky lovers, as a man like Thomas would be described with derision. But for the first time, they were walking the same path. Together. By day, Lena moved like a ghost across the plantation, measured, careful, watchful. But by night, in the hush of the woods beyond the cornfields, she came alive. That's where Thomas waited, tucked beneath a towering oak whose limbs spread like a canopy of secrets. There, hidden by night's forgiving veil, their forbidden love took root. Theirs was not a romance of grand gestures and spoken promises. It was the brushing of fingers and quiet murmurs of her name from his lips when no one could hear. A loaf of bread tucked in a napkin, still warm. And then under the stars, it became more. A bond of souls, not just bodies. Some nights, they talked about escape, about the North, where men weren't born into chains and women weren't property. Lena dreamed aloud of freedom, but never without the weight of grief, her brother's absence, her mother's silence, the fear that even freedom could be taken. "Do you ever wonder," she asked once, voice low and rough, "if love like ours can survive daylight?" Thomas didn't answer right away. The moonlight caught in his curls, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for hers. "I wonder if it can survive not being seen," he said. "And still, I know it's real." But even shadows have witnesses. A boy named Elijah, barely older than 12, had seen Lena slip through the fields one night. The next evening, he followed, silent and barefoot as a deer. He stopped when he heard voices. He couldn't see clearly, but he knew Lena's laugh, soft as a hummingbird's wings, and he knew the white boy's voice too. He waited until the rustling stopped and then ran back to the quarters. For days, he kept it to himself, but whispers began. Lena was distracted, her chores rushed, and someone saw Thomas passing her a note when he thought no one looked. Questions started to curl through the quarters like smoke from a low fire. Lena knew. She saw it in the way others avoided her eyes, in the way one woman pulled her child closer as she passed. "I should stop coming," she said one night. "They're watching. I'll get you in trouble." "You think I care?" Thomas said, the words sharper than he meant. "Let them watch. Let them talk." "But you can leave," she said. "You can walk away. You could marry any girl in Charleston and live in a house like your father's. I have no such choice. I have no name but the one they gave me. No future but what's stolen. So how do I know? How do I know I'm not just another passing sweetness to you?" Thomas stared at her, pained that she could even question his love, yet understanding her fear. "Lena," he said slowly, reaching into the pocket of his coat. From it, he pulled a small, weathered Bible. It had belonged to his mother's mother. He opened to the blank flyleaf, then looked her in the eyes. "I swear to you before God and in the presence of the watchers and the dumb stars above and this earth beneath us that I am yours. If I could, I'd marry you before a minister, in a church with rice and flowers. But this world won't give us that. So I offer you this." He took her hand, placed the Bible in her palm, then drew a silver knife from his boot. Not a weapon, but a carving blade. He led her to the base of the old oak, where the bark was thick and untouched. Carefully, he etched their names, Lena and Thomas, in small, looping script. Then he unwrapped a square of cloth he'd tucked into his coat. Inside was a braid of her hair, cruelly cut weeks before by her mistress, who'd scolded her for letting it grow past regulation. He had dumbly watched the disgrace of his woman, knowing that to defend her would be to risk a flogging for seducing him. But he had taken that single braid from the rubbish heap, washed it, and kissed it reverently before folding it into a square of silk cloth beside a lock of his own, clipped at the temple. He dug into the earth with his bare hands, not deep, but far enough that the frost wouldn't reach. Into the hole. He placed the braid, the lock, and a folded paper. "What's it say?" Lena asked. "A promise," he said, "that we loved, that we were husband and wife in the eyes of heaven, if not the laws of man, and that our hearts are buried here, side by side, for those who come after us." Then he covered the hole and pressed his palm flat against the ground. She knelt beside him, her hand over his. They stayed that way for a long time. That night, the stars seemed to burn brighter than they ever did, as though heaven was witnessing this moment and sealing it forever. They didn't speak much. There were no more debates, no doubts. Instead, they stood close, sharing the silence that followed truth. Thomas brushed his fingers across Lena's cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "I love you," he said, not urgently, not for the first time, but completely. And then in the quiet warmth of their shared world, she kissed him. Their first time together was not the stuff of romance novels or songs. It was gentle, reverent, two souls aching to become one in a world that insisted they never should. The earth was their floor, the stars their canopy. Every caress was laced with gratitude, every breath with awe. He touched her like she was sacred. She held him like she'd finally come home. After they lay curled together, wrapped in a single wool blanket, the scent of moss and pine in the air. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the strong assurance of his heartbeat. For the first time in her life, Lena didn't feel owned. She felt chosen. And Thomas? He'd never felt so free. But the world outside the woods did not rest. Tomorrow there would be questions, whispers, rumors sharpened into blades. But tonight, beneath the witness of moonlight and the old oak, they were husband and wife. The days blurred into each other like smoke trailing off a dying fire. Lena worked under the sun with a heaviness that hadn't been there before, not just in her limbs, but in her soul. Morning sickness had given her secret away to herself first. The dry heaving behind the smokehouse, the metallic taste in her mouth, the way the smell of lye soap made her stomach churn. She didn't need a midwife to tell her what her body already knew. She was carrying Thomas's child. The thought bloomed in her chest like wild kudzu. Tangled, fast-growing, dangerous. A child. Half hers, half his. Loved already. But in this world, a child born of a white master's son and an enslaved woman was not seen as a child of love. It was seen as property. Lena sat beneath the old oak where their vows lived in the soil. She clutched the bark, pressed her cheek against it, and wept. This child would never be free. Not here. Not with Thomas's father still alive. Still running a shadow trade of his own. Selling light-skinned children born in secret, raised to serve in fine coats behind plantation doors. Lena had heard the stories. Her friend Ruth's baby, born with gray eyes and fine curls, was gone by the time he turned 5. Sent north, the mistress had said, to serve where his looks will be appreciated. But Ruth knew. They all knew. When Lena told Thomas, he turned pale. He sat down hard on the porch of the slave quarters and put his head in his hands. "I should have prepared better," he whispered. "I should have gotten us out already." "We can't wait no more," Lena said, her voice low but steady. "You know what he does, what your father is." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we leave. Soon. I'll forge the papers. You'll need to ride in the wagon. I'll say you're a seamstress. I'm delivering for hire to Charleston. No one questions papers with the right signature." He had studied the documents for months, practicing his father's scrawl, the plantation seal, the slave registry forms. He'd been forging passes for others too, here and there, when he could. Quietly, desperately. He hadn't told Lena about all of them, more risk for her. But there had been some successes. A woman and her child, now in Kentucky. A field hand who made it to Ohio. This would be different. Lena was pregnant. They would be together. And if they were caught, "We'll go by night," he said, "through the old river trail behind the back fields. They don't guard it, not since the flood last year. Someone will need to drive the wagon." Thomas's eyes flickered. "I know someone." That night, Thomas met with an old field hand named Abraham. He had once been free, stolen into slavery by bounty hunters when he'd come too close to Virginia lines. He barely spoke above a whisper and walked with a limp. But his mind was sharp and his heart steady. "Underground line runs past Pine Hollow east of the ridge," Abraham said. "There's a station in a Quaker barn. Old woman there. Folks call her Widow Crane. She's helped many." "And you trust her?" "She's got no reason to lie. Lost her husband to Confederate raiders. Only helps folk heading north now." Thomas nodded. "Will you come with us?" "I'll ride halfway. Get y'all to Widow Crane. After that, it's on faith." The days that followed were a storm of tension and hurried preparation. Lena packed what little she could. A shawl her mother had made from scraps, a tin comb, the Bible Thomas gave her on the night he carved their names. She stitched the seams of her dress with dried okra seeds, hidden and useful if food grew scarce. Thomas spent his nights hunched over parchment, perfecting the travel papers. He sealed them with melted wax stolen from his father's desk and wrapped them in oiled cloth. Every creak of the house, every sudden silence of the birds set their hearts racing. Then came the night. It was overcast, dark enough to slip away, but not so black they couldn't see their path. Abraham had hitched 2 mules to the wagon and filled it with sacks of corn and flour, burying Lena beneath them with care. Thomas kissed her forehead, then covered her with burlap. "Don't speak unless I say. Don't move unless you must." "I won't," she whispered. "Just don't leave me. Never." Abraham cracked the reins. The wheels began to turn. They rode silently for hours. Once they were stopped at a Confederate patrol point. A young man in gray uniform, eyes dull with fatigue. "What's your business?" he asked, peering into the wagon. "Delivering cloth and meal to Charleston," Thomas said, handing him the papers. The soldier looked at the seal, frowned, and stepped back. "Keep moving then. Road ain't safe tonight." They passed. Lena didn't breathe again until the wagon creaked around the bend. When they reached the fork at Pine Hollow, Abraham pulled the mules aside. "Off here," he said. "Follow the creek bed for a mile. Look for a red ribbon tied to a post. That's Widow Crane's place." He placed his hand on Lena's shoulder. "I seen a lot in my years. Ain't never seen love like this. Y'all be safe now. Thomas and Lena climbed down, clutching hands as they melted into the woods. They followed the creek, the moon breaking through just enough to guide them. Lena moved slower now, her body weary, her breath short, but she didn't stop. And then they saw it, the red ribbon fluttering on a post, and behind it, a squat barn with a warm light glowing from the slats. A woman stepped out, a lantern in her hand, white-haired, with eyes like cold water and a voice like honey on stone. "You made it," she said. "Come, you'll rest here tonight. In the morning, we move again." Thomas and Lena stepped into the barn, into the warmth, into a world that had just cracked open. They weren't safe yet, but they were no longer trapped. And for the first time, their child stirred gently in Lena's womb, as if it too knew that something had shifted. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was a direction. The days blurred into a desperate march. The weather turned, the sun sharp as knives by day, frost licking the air by night. Lena and Thomas traveled mostly under cover of darkness now, sheltering in barns, caves, even dugouts carved out of creek banks. Widow Crane had handed them off to another conductor on the Underground Railroad, a black preacher named Noah who knew the safe paths by heart. But safety was fragile. Word had spread. A notice had gone up in the towns. A runaway Negro woman, possibly pregnant, traveling with a white man presumed kidnapped or seduced. A reward offered by the father himself, $500 alive, $300 dead. And with that bounty came the dogs. They heard them first in Virginia. Not close, but unmistakable, the long, rolling barks trained to catch human scent. Thomas gripped Lena's hand tighter every time the howling floated on the wind. Lena, now showing, moved slower. Her breath came harder, and still she pressed on. But she was no longer dreaming. Her eyes were tired, set not with hope, but with a determination soaked in fear. She could not lose him. She could not lose this chance. They stayed in a tobacco drying shed one night, tucked behind a collapsing mill. Noah had left them 3 days earlier, heading back south to guide another group. He'd pressed a small pistol into Lena's hand before he left. "Don't use it unless you must, but if you must, don't hesitate." Thomas stood watch while Lena rested, curled against a straw-stuffed sack. That night, she woke with a gran of agony which she instinctively muffled. Her nightdress was soaked, blood. Thomas rushed to her, but she was already sitting up, sobbing, cradling her belly. "I think," she choked out. "I think it's happening." He didn't need to ask what she meant. The next hours were a blur of agony and trembling hands. Thomas lit a small lantern and helped as best he could. He'd read medical texts. He'd studied with a union nurse in secret back when he still believed this war would end quickly. None of it prepared him. By dawn, it was over. The blood had slowed. The small bundle they'd wrapped in linen was still. They buried their child beneath the roots of a young pine with only the birds for witnesses. Lena placed the Bible over the grave, whispering a psalm between cracked lips. Thomas sat beside her, speechless, one arm around her shaking shoulders. "He would have had your eyes," she murmured. Thomas held back tears. They did not speak much after that. Grief wrapped them in silence more profound than words. But they kept moving. 2 days later, near the border of Pennsylvania, they were ambushed. The bounty hunters didn't ride in fast. They crept. First, the snapping of twigs, then the glint of metal. Then a shout, "Stop! Drop the satchel and get on the ground!" Lena and Thomas ran. They didn't speak, didn't think, just moved. Through brambles, through icy creeks, over fallen logs. The world shrank to sound and breath and survival. A shot cracked. Thomas stumbled. He cried out, falling to his knees. His shoulder was bleeding, dark red soaking through his shirt. Lena doubled back. "Thomas, go," he gasped. "Keep going." She helped him to his feet, dragging his arm over her shoulders. He was hurt, and her body was still healing. But they didn't stop. They were running for their lives, and that knowledge gave them wings. Behind them, voices. Then another shot. It missed, but the next one might not. She saw the creek up ahead, rushing, wide. She didn't know how deep. She didn't care. They crashed into the water, the cold seizing them like chains. She screamed, dragging Thomas with her, pushing forward with everything she had left. Branches slapped their faces. Mud sucked at their boots, but they crossed. On the far side, a rock outcrop offered cover. Lena dragged Thomas behind it, collapsed beside him. The shouts grew fainter, then stopped. Hours passed. The wind cut them raw. Thomas drifted in and out, feverish and pale with the sudden blood loss. She tore strips from her dress to bind his shoulder. She whispered to him, songs her mama used to hum. "Stay with me. We got this far. We ain't done yet." He stirred once and opened his eyes. "Lena, I'm sorry. About the baby. About everything." She took his face in her hands. "We still got each other. That's more than most ever do." And finally, she let herself believe. They crossed the last field under the cloak of dusk, Lena clutching Thomas's arm, their bodies tired, torn, but still moving. His wound, half-healed and wrapped in rough linen, slowed them, but Lena refused to let him stop, not when they were so close. Beyond the line of trees, lanterns flickered in the window of a small clapboard house. A quilt hung from the porch, black and gold, with a flying geese pattern. The sign, the signal. Lena had seen it before, in whispered maps passed between trembling hands. The abolitionist woman who answered their knock barely spoke a word. She ushered them in, offered a bowl of broth, and helped Thomas to a bed by the fire. Lena sat beside him, holding his hand in both of hers. They had made it. Past dogs, past frost, past pain, past death, and they were free. But freedom, they quickly learned, came with its own chains. When they reached the nearest northern town to begin again, stares followed them. Some eyes filled with curiosity, others with quiet revulsion. A white man with a black woman, walking side by side, married in spirit if not in law, was a wound too fresh for many to stomach. They rented a small room above a blacksmith's shop. Thomas, after weeks of searching, finally found work keeping ledgers for a merchant who needed a helper more than he hated their union. Lena baked bread and stitched clothes for other freed women who gathered in secret to learn reading and writing. They did what all survivors do. They built, but it was a difficult life. Nights were quiet now, save for the rare nightmares when Lena would sometimes awaken with a gasp, hand pressed to the place where life had once bloomed in her belly. Thomas would hold her close, neither of them speaking. The ache of loss and the memory of the child they never met stretched silently between them. Thomas knew that his wife needed peace, only some of which they had found in their little town. So he wrote to his mother's relatives in France, telling only part of the truth. Moved by his plea, they sent enough through a trusted banker for him to buy a modest farm on the outskirts of a tolerant countryside town. There, just as spring unfurled, Lena gave birth to a boy child who they named Isaac. And so they lived. And in time, they laughed. They carved out joy from small things. The way the spring sun glinted off the spring, the way Isaac toddled and fell on his bum. The Sunday evenings where Lena would hum old hymns and Thomas would read aloud from books he collected. They were no longer hiding, no longer bound. They were seen now, by God, by each other, and by the world, for better or worse. Under a broad oak on the outskirts of town, Lena and Thomas planted a sapling, one grown from the acorn of the tree beneath which they had buried their vows, locks of hair and love. They watered it with care, as though nurturing something sacred, because they were. On the stone nearby, Thomas carved again, this time not in secrecy but with purpose. For what love could not silence, freedom now protects. They had crossed more than rivers and battlefields. They had crossed the border of bondage into breath, of secrecy into truth, of mourning into life. The world would spend tens of decades more turning slowly toward justice, but they had already crossed over, together.
Hi, please click on the subscribe button and maybe leave a comment. Thanks.